All right, let's go ahead and start. If I can remind you to please put your cell phones on mute. Um, in 2013, I got a really strange email from somebody who asked me, well, he first began to explain how behavioral biologists weren't really very technologically sophisticated, which is true enough. And we go about it doing it all wrong, in the sense that we look and see what technology is available, and then we use it to try to answer whatever questions we want to ask. And this email was from somebody in the Georgia Tech Department of Computer Sciences. And he said he wanted to do a proposal, write a proposal to get a fellowship from STRI to use the Gamboa behavioral biology community as the topic for his PhD. And I thought, well, that sounds pretty interesting, but I was skeptical that the committee would ever fund it. And it turned out I was wrong. And that person is today's speaker, Andy Quitmeyer. So he got his PhD from Georgia Tech, and then he did some various other activities before accepting a position as an assistant professor at the National University in Singapore. And after 2 years, he and his partner voted against the university giving them tenure, and then they left. And they've relocated over the years to Gamboa. And so Andy is now going to tell us today about one of his latest projects, helping biologists to use modern technology that doesn't cost a lot because he can build it himself.
Awesome. Can y'all hear me okay? I bet probably. Thank you very much, Bill, for the very nice introduction. There's only one correction I want to make to that introduction, which is I was not saying that the biologists were doing everything wrong. I was saying the opposite. I was saying the engineers keep coming around and bossing around the field biologists and making them do a very tech-centered focus, and that the biologists, the naturalists, were the ones that I actually wanted to have be modeling their own technology. So that's the only slight change that. And I'm going to talk about an example of that today, of how we can make technology that's more crafted by the nature, by the field, and by the people using things, rather than just having a thing that's like, hey, I've got a cool new thing. You have to use this to do your biology with now. So very much I'm on the naturalist side. That's the whole goal of everything we kind of do. So today we're talking about the Mothbox. Mothbox, it's a fun thing. It's an artificially intelligent insect monitor for open source science. The real basics of what it does: it turns on a big bright light, bugs come on by, it takes photos of these cool bugs. The photos kind of look like that. Then it has some AI things that look at all the different cool bugs, and it tries to automatically identify them for you. It's pretty fun. You get to see what the bugs are up to. And the funnest part about it all is you can build the whole thing yourself. These parts cost about 350 bucks, and you can have your own automated insect monitoring thing that's weatherproof and super fun. But before I get kind of into that, I'm going to rewind a little bit, tell you a little bit more about who's the weird guy standing in front of you talking loudly. So who are we? So I'm Andy. That right there is Kitty. She's my partner. And together, along with some of our animal friends, we help run digital naturalism laboratories. Ooh, cool. That's the jungle, if you haven't seen the jungle. It's much more wowing in front of tech audiences. And what we do is we work with art and technology for interacting with nature. And what we try to do is try to build as many of these things as we can in the wild or near the wild, or iterate with these things in not human controlled environments. And so Dynalab itself is a little house that's solar powered in Gamboa with a workshop. So there we are. We're just in Gamboa. If you haven't been by, it says Dynalab on the side of the house. And we have prototyping facilities, laser cutters, 3D printers, and we do most of our own upcycling. We recycle our own materials to make prototyping tools with, because, you know, we're far away from the city, and we don't really like creating more garbage. So we actually consume lots of garbage, and we use that to make molds or 3D prints or laser cut things out of garbage itself, which is pretty cool. We also run a lot of art and science events. We teach field courses all around the world, different design courses, help take a bunch of tech people and force them to go play in nature with pine cones. That's always fun. And we also run a couple different conferences. So for one, I founded and run a conference called the Digital Naturalism Conference. We're having the 4th one in the outskirts of Bali in June 2025. In case you're interested, let me know. It should be pretty cool. Also help organize and run a conference called the Gathering for Open Science Hardware. And the most recent one of these happened in 2022 here in Panama. And many of you amazing people were actually involved with that and helped make that happen. It was super cool. And with all these events and things that we do, in general, what we're trying to do is get field biologists, engineers, designers, and artists, and pretty much just anyone who's interested in non-human life together to help build new things for interacting with nature in new kinds of ways. So just one quick instance, in one of our Dynacons, the Digital Naturalism conferences, there was some biologists hanging around who really wanted to see what was up in the forest canopy. And they had some like camera traps, but the trees, and they had some drones, but the drones couldn't fly up in those trees. It was too thick. And they were like, we want to see what's going on up there. And there was a fun robotic artist who was there and was like, oh, I'll build you something. Whips up this cool tree climbing robot in a day. And they use it to go prowl around this forest canopy in Thailand. And then they went and shared this, and other people can build it. And it's just like a fun, quick thing for, you know, different ways of kind of rethinking how we can interact and study and look at natural kinds of things. And this is kind of the crux of what we do at Dynalab. We design tools for interacting with nature. We've done this in other kind of settings, in nature that's held captive. For instance, we do a lot of animal enrichment work. This was a class that I taught in Singapore with the Singapore Zoo, and we were building enrichment tools for, this is a red panda, it's super cute. This was a really fun enrichment toy for sun bear there. The sun bears are really smart and really like to forage, and they get really bored. And when animals get bored in captivity, it not only hurts their mental health, it can actually hurt their physical health a lot too. And so our students and I helped build, this is a honey maze. So it actually has a tongue sensor that can sense the sun bear's long tongue, and it squirts honey wherever the tongue isn't. So the bear always has to go hunting for where the honey is located. And then this is our lovely friend Valencia, who's in Gamboa with us. She's a tapir, an orphaned tapir, and she gets real grumpy if she does not have enough food or activity and starts getting grumpy. And so instead, me and Kitty help make her some fun toys and give her some enrichment throughout the days and make her a lot more chill and calm. And so along with kind of enrichment tools, kind of main thing we do is designing tools for field biology, for field biologists. And people always want a bunch of examples. And so we got a bunch of examples. There's like a 360-degree camera trap that we made a bunch of prototypes with. There's I love this, the pollinator. Some scientists wanted to figure out how buff their butterflies were, see how strong their legs were. So we helped them make a butterfly strength tester device. This was a floating fishing bat sensor thing. It had cameras and little gimbals for Jenna Coles, who she just did her PhD, right? Yeah, go Jenna. This was another fun butterfly project where Denise actually came to me and was like, hey, I've got these camera traps And we found out that the butterflies can actually trigger the IR sensor on the camera traps. These are just stock off-the-shelf camera traps. And I was surprised by that, because usually they don't respond to something like smaller than like an agouti. But the butterflies could trigger it. But the problem was the cameras had to be very close to the butterflies. And so we actually went to the Gathering for Open Science hardware conference. We were figuring out how to like hack the lens on it and stuff. And then we realized like, oh, we just need to make it like, give it old people glasses. So we just gave it reading glasses for $2. And now we can get these beautiful crystal clear pictures automatically of butterflies visiting things. It's a super, super fun, cool hack. And you can have folks like Christopher Lawrence is actually testing out putting little QR codes on the butterfly. So you can have a whole system built from kind of off the shelf parts for $2, and actually just $1, because you can chop the reading glasses in half, right? And so importantly, everything we do at our lab, it's all open source. And if it's not open, if it's not a tool that other people can use and replicate, it's not actually science. And I'll rant about this more later, but just putting that out there because it's very important. And the cool open science project that we're working on right now is this thing called the Mothbox. But of course, we're not going to go straight into it. We're going to give background. I love more and more background, okay? Background on the Mothbox. So bring yourself back to 1940. There's Americans everywhere here. There's World War II. The Americans, what do they want? Hamburgers. They want hamburgers. The US declares, we need hamburgers for all the military people here. Hey, Panama, nice peninsula you got there. Let's chop it down and grow cows. And so this whole peninsula used to be a lot of like rainforest. And if you go there today, it is not rainforest. And I didn't even know this the first time I went there. I just thought it was like, oh, it's like a different climate of Panama. We got cool different biomes, you know, but it's like dry, it's grassland. This has actually been changed drastically by all this farming there. It's a way different place than it used to be. And this made a lot of hamburgers for a while, but a lot of aspects of this chop down all the forests and grow cows program didn't really work out that well for a lot of the residents or the local nature there, because most of this land is now so depleted. Most of the farmers there can't even get loans from the bank to actually do a lot of the cattle farming they used to be able to, because the land is so quickly depleted that they can't really grow the grass and stuff the cows need to survive. And of course, there you have big problems with a lot of the nature that used to live there before like 1940 is not having that great of a time. And so there's actually some nice new opportunities happening with some cool local groups that are like Pro Eco Azuero and Pantera that are actually working with a lot of these farmers to try to take their farmland that is just sitting there and they can't grow cows on anymore, and actually try to help reforest it. And so importantly, a lot of these groups like Pro Eco Azuero, they're actually doing a ton of really important work that often gets overlooked in big reforestation projects. One, they're working with the communities there. They're having the community people actually want to join this, to buy in, to do education about the importance of forests and stuff in this area. The other thing, and this surprised me when I first learned about it, is they're planting native plants. Now, for me, I thought this was just like a given, like, oh, we're going to reforest it, let's put the forest back there. It turns out, if you look globally, about 90% of reforestation programs, 90%, plant huge monocultures. They're not reforesting, they're planting big tree farms. And so when these reforesting terms end in about 30 years, your big tree farm, they can just go harvest it. And most of the time, these aren't even using native species. These are using things like teak, which there's no teak originally around here. The animals don't care about giant monocultures of teak. And instead, these people are doing a lot of the really hard work of finding dozens, over 100 local species of different trees to grow, cultivating them, and then planting them, and then caring for them and trying to get them going. And that's all really tough. And it's also on a huge scale. We got a whole peninsula they're trying to basically, terraform here. And so when really cool, interesting nature things are happening at big scales, really cool scientists want to go and study and be like, what's going on here? And so you have folks like Daisy Dent leading a really cool research project into studying how can we do biodiversity monitoring in these areas that are going to be reforested. What changes when you actually reforest an area? How does that compare to like primary forest? What does a burnt cattle land look like in terms of biodiversity compared to a regrown forest, compared to a teak monoculture, compared to a primary forest? These are the kinds of questions they're really curious about answering. And as you all probably can tell, these are really big questions, right? And so like, how do you actually study? Biodiversity is a huge nebulous concept, right? And so how are they studying this? The answer is they're just, trying a bunch of things. And there's no, correct exact way for how to do this yet. So they're trying to figure out these ways. And there's traditional methods that they're doing, gentry transects for tree diversity. But there's also like newer approaches using things like camera traps or acoustic monitoring, seeing what the soundscape, seeing how does a burnt farm sound differently versus a primary forest, trying to figure out what species are there from the sounds they make. But then also, they're working at innovating new methods for trying to look at areas of biodiversity that haven't been studied as much. So you can have, it seems odd to me now to be like, oh, the traditional camera trapping approach, but it is weird. Like camera traps have been around for like the past 100 years. They're invented on like BCI with big explosions. It's super cool. If you haven't heard about camera trap history, it's very neat. But so we're trying to help them figure out a new kind of sensor for doing this biodiversity monitoring, which brings up the question, why are we looking at insects? Why study moths? And there's some answers to this. And one thing, and this is another thing that I only found out in the past couple of weeks that's kind of like blowing my mind a little bit. So scientists have been scientisting around for a couple hundred years, right? They really like naming things. And so we've probably named about 2 million different living things by now. We got like 2 million species, but we're like, here's the name for that thing. Of those 2 million things that we've come up with names for, half of those are insects, which is like, that includes like bacteria, like all the funguses and stuff like that. Half of those things, insects. And then again, of all those things that are alive, 1 out of every 5 of those is a beetle. There's like 400,000 beetle species. And something I also didn't know, there's a ton of moths. 1 out of every 14, again, things alive on Earth that we have a name for is a moth. So 1/14 of the species on Earth are moths. It's super, super wild. And what's cool is when you're studying biodiversity, you're using animals themselves as kind of a sensor, as kind of a variable that you're using to look at an environment. And the more specious a thing is, the kind of higher resolution sensor you're able to deal with. If you're able to look at one, farmland and it has, 800 different cool species you found here, and then this other forest area has 1,200 species of things over here, and this teak forest has 1,400 species, but they overlap with 300 of these species and 200 of these species, you're able to start drawing lots of much richer inferences you can versus things like mammals, for instance. Remember I said there's like about 1 million insects out of 2 million species? There's only about 6,500 species of mammals. And while doing things like camera trapping, you're gonna get a lot of very interesting, rich data. But in terms of like species, using the species as like a sensor itself, the number of monkeys that you might spot, I could probably count on my hand, right? In pretty much like all of Panama. So they're not as hyper diverse. Another reason to look at insects is they can be hyper localized. Again, thinking of these creatures as kind of sensors, they can help provide us a tool that has a really high spatial resolution. So some of these insects, again, they're very specious. Some can be even endemic to certain areas. You're not going to find these anywhere else in the world. They might be just on, little pockets, little islands, things like that. And then a cool thing about things like moths is many of them have caterpillars that are actually host specific. So meaning this moth has a caterpillar that only eats this plant. And so if you see this moth show up on your moth sensor or whatever, you actually can use that as a proxy for being like, oh, hey, we know these plants are around because this moth's around. Again, I don't mean to, I feel like I'm kind of dragging this poor monkey here. If you have something like the mammals, you might see this cool monkey crossing through some burnt farmland, but it's not necessarily giving you as small of a spatial unit as you might want. This monkey can move across big distances. A very naive approach would be like, hey, I set a camera trap up in a farm. I took a picture of a monkey. Monkeys live in farms. Like done. But a more nuanced approach might consider like, oh, monkeys can actually cover a larger territory. It's very rare to see them on the ground, so it's probably fleeing from maybe like one destroyed habitat to another. It's probably been forced to move. So you can draw different insights with different types of creatures. And kind of one of the other things about why I work with insects, we figured out how to hack them pretty easily. So long ago, probably from cavemen hanging around fires and noticing the bugs start acting funny around big bright lights, we figured out that big bright lights kind of jam a lot of the navigation software in some of these insects, and it makes them kind of spiral. They think the whole Earth is moving in a weird way. Their whole world, the whole universe is, and they need to just land on something and just chill out for a while till everything stops spinning. And we can use this to actually lure them in and help kind of study them. Then you can hang out with your friends. You can take a notebook and write down who's visiting or whatever. Versus, again, monkeys, we put on a big light, monkeys didn't show up. So again, minus for non-insects. That one's more facetious. But despite how cool it can be and all the bonuses to work with insects, it's still really hard though. With the exception of a couple giant moths, one big problem, insects pretty small. So that's problem number one, they're really small. Another problem is you got to kind of like stay up all night. If you're doing, people for probably the past 100 years have been doing this kind of moth lighting approach. And if you haven't done it, it's a really fun thing to do. Go out in the forest, hang up a sheet, get a really bright light, preferably like a big UV light, turn it on, let all your bugs kind of gather, and then see who's visiting. This is it's a cool way of doing kind of population census, seeing what kind of cool things you can find. But a real challenge of it is that you got to stay up all night. You got to be hanging out there. Different insects are going to show up at 4 a.m. then that show up at like 7:30 p.m. And so if you really want to do the thorough detailing of what's happening there, you got to hang out. You got to meticulously go through and mark down every tiny insect that's visiting. Oftentimes when you're doing this kind of thing as well, you have to carry out usually a big, fragile, hot, power-hungry bulb, usually like a big mercury vapor lamp or something like that. Carry it out into the field, hope you don't break it, along with probably like a big car battery. Who here has carried a car battery into the field before? Yeah, so a lot of y'all, you've been there. It's not the funnest thing to do. And so then after that, you have to stay there all night. And this is cool for getting, a kind of fun activity, point census of things to do. But in terms of scaling it, if you're trying to do this in thousands of places across the Azuero Peninsula over the course of months, this is going to be a very, very difficult thing to try to scale up. You're going to have a lot of caffeine and a lot of people who are really interested in bugs. And so there's got to be a better way, right? So Hubert was just joining on this project to study this biodiversity, and he came across this paper from 21 by Bjerg et al. About making an automated light trap to monitor moths. And we're like, hey, that seems cool. Let's let the robots do the boring part. And so we started looking at, okay, what other kind of automated insect monitoring systems are out there? And so we started researching them, and we encountered a couple different problems. One, a lot of them were really pricey. A lot of these automated insect systems that you see out being used right now can be $9,000 to $15,000 for a lot of the basic ones. Another challenge was many of these were closed source, or even if they were open, we couldn't find any information about them. There's very little publicly available information about not only just how to build the thing, but like what parts are in it, what camera is it using. Some of these we actually had to like, go in and find, publicity photos of things and like zoom in and be like, oh, they're using the Logitech camera. And, kind of reverse engineering things like that to see how they were doing it. And it brings up another problem that we encountered was many of these current systems were kind of too low resolution for Hubert's needs. Hubert really wants to be able to really try to figure out, not at a species level, but maybe like genus or like family of what a lot of these insects are. And for that, a lot of them, remember I said they're small, you want to be able to see them at really tiny levels. And a lot of these cameras were like 8 to 16 megapixels. It's basically like a webcam, which can be good for if you want to just get a general idea of like, hey, we had more insects yesterday than today, and some were moths and some were beetles. But past that, you really need kind of a higher resolution. And probably one of the biggest problems that made a lot of these existing systems a no-go for our project was they're just too big. A lot of these things, they're about the size like a huge pelican case. It's really hard to travel with them. They're big and bulky. They catch the attention of the customs people when you're coming through. They can get, it's a big headache. And then once you get to the field, it's hard to carry that whole thing, especially when normally it takes you a whole day to get up some of these mountains that Hubert's going up. And carrying a whole case like that is basically just impossible. So we're like, hey, let's build our own Mothbox, right? We actually came up with the name Mothbox because we were like, well, we need a name for this. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to say Mothbox because it's a box and we look at moth, and this is a terrible name and we should change it as soon as we come up with a better name. Unfortunately, we've never come up with a better name, but now it's kind of grown on me. But the very first iterations were me just shoving electronics inside like an old Tupperware container with some lights around and, doing a basic proof of concept. And from then, we just kept iterating and testing out different ones. There was even a fun design I had going for a while where we used like, like antennas from like old cars. And so like the target would kind of like pop out. It was really fun. Did not work because we test things out in the field. And you know what happens when you leave a bunch of those things out in the field? They get all rusty. Those little things, they bend a little bit. It's very important to do field testing. There's two things that terrify any kind of engineer. One thing is leaving your beautiful thing you've spent months designing out in the middle of the jungle while it's where it rains, where there's bugs and stuff like that. But it's incredibly important because it's the only way your designs can actually start having some real world impact is if they can actually stand up to the real world. The other most terrifying thing to do with something that you've made or designed is to give it to other people to use. Because you're like, oh yeah, I made this thing, it works really good. And as soon as somebody else says, they're like, oh, it broke. And I'm like, well, you didn't press the 4 buttons correctly in the right sequence, of course. And so what happens is you learn a lot about yourself because whenever you're building something, and even when you're designing things like scientific experiments, you're often in your own head and you have a bunch of hidden assumptions about things that you didn't even realize you had this assumption about. Like, of course, people are going to press these 4 buttons instead of these bigger buttons over here for some reason. So you learn a lot of this. And that's why it's really important to do community testing, to actually give your thing, as scary as it can be, to other people and have them use it and then study and see how they're actually using it. And so we've been doing this project for only about 1.5 years now. And it's been a super scrappy, fun little project. We kicked it off, our little Tupperware box with electronics. We had about $3,000 of funding that we got from a group called Earthshot. That led to some iterations and testings, which then Michigan State University gave us another $3,000 to try to help them make a sensor for when they were doing stuff for the X Prize. And then by basically last year, we got $10,000 from experiment.com to try to develop kind of like a third version of this Mothbox. And Daisy Dent helped Her research project helped pay for some engineering time to make a really good, robust kind of third version of the Mothbox. And by March, we were super lucky to have received the wildlabs.net project grant for $60K. And this has been funding us ever since. We're about halfway through this $60K grant. And all this money, I think maybe together, the entire project, past a year and a half, about $90K. This includes like design time, all the parts and equipment, the shipping of the stuff, hiring field assistants, hiring documentation people to help do this, helping hire people to translate things. This all costs less than about what, maybe like 6 of the 15K other automated insect monitors. So we work at really scrappy, low cost levels to try to get a thing that can work kind of out there as quickly as possible, which brings us to the kind of version 4. This is our state of the art, brand new, beautiful baby. That's actually currently, there's about like 14 of them out in the wild right now, collecting moths. They're actually probably waiting till it gets dark. But last night they were out capturing moths. We get something like, we're getting like probably like 40 gigs a day, pulling in all this information of just cool moth photos. And there, I'm secretly already working on version 5, but pretend that this is the state of the art. So let's learn more about this thing. What is this thing? How do you use it? It looks really difficult, right? It's complicated. Look, there's weird lights, there's glowing things. This moth pooped a bunch all over here for some reason. This looks confusing, right? It's not. It's surprisingly not too difficult to use. First step, find a place you want to see where the bugs are at. Hang it on a tree. Hang it on like a tripod if you don't have a tree. Then you just leave it. It's got an internal schedule. It turns itself on automatically and it starts luring in. It turns on a big bright light like this. Big and bright. And it starts luring in bugs. And it takes photos of them, super high resolution photos, and then it just kind of does it. And you go hang out. You don't have to stay up till 4 in the morning babysitting your bugs. You can wake up sometimes like because you're curious and you're like, ooh, that mountain's all glowy now because we got cool moth boxes down there. And if you're really worried and you're like, oh, but I want my own special schedule or something like that, I'm gonna have to like program things, do a whole computers. You barely have to do a computers to like really get this thing going. If you want to reschedule this right now, it goes on for about 5 hours a night. And it does pretty much every hour throughout the night. That's kind of our standard schedule. If you want to change this in any way, all you need to do, there's a little text document. You can just edit that, pop a little USB stick in. It takes care of the rest for you. It doesn't even have to be every consecutive night. You can program this thing to go on whenever you want. You can be like August 28th at 4 p.m. I need to go on right then. That's fine. It's great. And importantly, you don't have to do any kind of sophisticated programming. Then once your things have been out there and they've left, you left them out. They run for about 4 days on the standard schedule, but you might have a different schedule. Maybe you're leaving it out there for a month or two. You just go collect it. You grab a little USB out of it. You look at your cool pictures. This is kind of an optional step, but you can't kind of resist doing it. You're like, ooh, what do we get? Do we get anything big and cool? And then it has 2 different little open source AI scripts that we run. The first one just tries to figure out where there's bugs because you have a big image, right? And there's lots of bugs. So the first little AI script just goes like, oh, hey, there's a bug here. Oh, hey, there's a bug here. Hey, there's a bug here. And I apologize to any like Umat's not here, right? Or okay, good. So I'm using the word bug just to pretty much mean insect. I'm aware of, I'm not just talking about hemipterans. So anyway, I'm just using bug colloquially. So the first thing just looks at where all the cool bugs are, makes little different pictures. The second AI thing is a modified version of a cool program called BioClip, which then you give it a taxonomic level you want to try to identify things up to. So let's say just the order. I just want to know like, hey, is this a butterfly or is it like an ant, or is it like a beetle? It goes through and it goes like, hey, I think these are butterflies. This is great. What's important is that we then have a human in the loop here. And this is something that we designed very intentionally, because a lot of engineers and engineering things, they'll get a problem and they'll be like, okay, well, our goal is we're going to solve the problem. I got to give you the species, every one of those species. And so there's been actually a lot of other insect identification things that just automatically just try to give you the exact species of what they are. But if you talk to insect people, like this is Evan that I met at Beetlepalooza last month, and Evan's an awesome beetle scientist who gave a presentation about identifying one single beetle. And it said it took him about 3 hours just to identify one specific beetle. And this involves not just a flat picture. You got to rotate this thing around. You got to use a microscope to identify the follicular scrobe and see if there's a follicle coming out of that scrobe or not for this type of beetle. And so this stuff is never going to happen for these automated pictures going on like this. And instead, what we can do is we can adjust to whatever taxonomic level you're kind of comfortable with. And so we have someone like Evan go and look at all the predictions from the AI thing, which are great because like for something like the order level, it got about 95% of these correct, which was awesome. And also like really useful and very helpful when you're organizing thousands and thousands of photos from a night. You can quickly then see like, oh, hey, it says this one's a Lepidopteran, but it's obviously a beetle. Or this is like a smudge from when, you know, a moth pooped all over the screen or something like that. So there's like a little bit of cleanup you can do, but then you can iteratively make a nice clean version, correct all those through a little interface that we built. And then you can feed it back to the AI system and be like, hey, take me down to the family level now. And so then you can go down there and you can then go and recorrect it. And so in this way, we can kind of iterate, and then we can even retrain the AI parts to actually learn to be better, especially useful in very specific regions. For instance, we had some that were trained on like things in Panama. They didn't work as well for IDing things in like Ohio when we were at Beetlepalooza. But we can locally kind of train things to help work even better and kind of have the scientist in the loop there. So some specifications about this thing, what's in the Mothbox, what's actually happening. So it's got a Raspberry Pi in it. That's kind of the computer. So who's heard of a Raspberry Pi here? Beautiful, awesome. 10 years ago, this was not as many hands. This is great. So it's a little tiny computer, costs about 60 bucks. They actually just came out with a new one that's only 50 bucks. So the prices are even cheaper now for how to build the Mothbox. You spend 10 bucks on, I don't know, cool moth cozy. And so you can then hook up a really high resolution camera that's only about $80 to it. So your imaging system is about like 150 bucks, something like that. And you can get a nice 64 megapixel image. And again, this is important because a lot of cameras that you can get, they tend to max out at something like 16 megapixels. This is like a 1920, 1080 kind of image. Or no, like a 36, that's an 8 megapixel. Anyway, but a 60 megapixel image, you have this little small moth and you're taking a big picture. You're not going to get as many details. With the 64 megapixel camera, you can actually get little individual hairs on the moth right there. And this is important not only to the person trying to identify things, but also to the AI system. It helps pull out little cues that might help train a little bit. What's perhaps excited us even more is that with a really high resolution camera like this, it lets us go really small. A lot of moths, when we see moths, we want like the big showy moths, right? Like, oh, this is Saturnid, cool, look, it's big, right? Those are just like show moths. The real cool moths are the micro moths, right? This is what I've been told. And so micro moths, moths can get small. And so a nice thing is we can actually get things that are insects that are sub-millimeter. So this is a little fly that's about 0.5 millimeter long. It's barely within the resolution range, but I didn't even notice it when I was flicking through the photos myself. But when I actually ran the computer vision on it, it actually pulled it up and it's like, oh, hey, you got an insect here. I'm like, oh, cool. And, you know, I can actually kind of tell, it's like, oh, it seems kind of like it's a fly. I can tell it doesn't look like it's a moth to me, something like that. And so being able to go deep and small is another cool advantage of it. In terms of the power, so this thing can run for about 21 continuous hours. The thing that uses the most energy is, again, the big, bright UV invisible light that's turning on. That sucks up probably 90% of all the power. The computer itself barely uses any energy, and the flashlights are the other main source sucking up energy. A regular schedule has about 5 hours runtime overnight, so you can do about 4 nights in a row without even having to recharge it. But this thing can also lay dormant for over 6 months. So if you just want to do 1 night every month, that's fine. You got 4 months of sampling. You can just leave it and then go and collect it if you want. A cool thing about the batteries that we got, these are the biggest battery that you can fly with, where the TSA won't bug you. And so they tend to get used for like CPAP machines, the things that help like people sleep. And they're really powerful. They have a dedicated on-off switch, and they have a lot of fun other features that we kind of discovered about them. For instance, they're really easy to add extra power to. You can hook up most foldable solar panels straight to them. Just boom, right there. Now you got a solar powered Mothbox. If you don't want 21 hours, you're like, oh, I really need 42 hours. Just add another battery. You can just plug another battery straight in. You want 63 hours? Go ahead. Third battery. There you go. I'm here to sell Mothboxes. Okay. And even if you're near a building, you can just plug it into a wall too. You can have your continuous wall outlet power. Everything's super weatherproof. One of the first things that we were testing is just leaving this thing outdoors in the rainy season, in Gamboa, in Pipeline Road. It gets rained on. The lights actually help clear up. If you had camera traps, a problem you may have noticed probably is sometimes it rains and it gets all foggy and you have like a day's worth of camera trap footage that's all like foggy and blurry. A bonus feature, these lights actually have some heat to them, kind of heats it up. You can clear up like a rained on foggy lens in just like a couple minutes. It's pretty cool. I was happy to see that happening. It's probably not submergible. Like, don't put your Mothbox, like I saw this guy who did moths. Like I work on a coral reef. I'm gonna put it underwater. Probably don't do that yet. You can talk to me if we need to make something that goes underwater, but above water with lots of water raining on it, you're fine. And probably one of the most important features is this thing is small and tiny. This Pelican case is the maximum size of a carry-on luggage thing. You can fit 4 Mothboxes right in there. I put little backpack straps on it. I was carrying it around Ecuador at the Butterfly Conference. It is super nice. I got 4 Mothboxes I can fit in there. I can fit 6 in another Pelican-sized case. They're less than 3 kilograms each, so you can hike around with them. They're not too heavy. And you can it really makes a difference having something this portable to where you can go. You can do multiple target sizes if you want. Our standard's kind of an A4 paper size. We have deployments all over. We've tested it many different places in the world, like Peru, Ecuador, and the US. Right now, as I said, we have deployments all over Azuero and Perací, Playa Venal, Cambutal. We have some in like Volcan, like Mount Tutumas, and some even at the La Fortuna station right now. So they're all capturing cool bugs from all over. It's going really cool. And really exciting to me is people actually starting to build this thing. So it's been already built by independent scientists. Some people in the UK were like, hey, we built one of your things. I'm like, this is really cool. Been built by non-specialists, even built by kids. We have some friends in Providence, Rhode Island, who do wildlife classes with children in the library program there. And they got some Mothboxes and they're building some Mothboxes with the kids there, which is really fun. And so the main thing, earlier I said I was trying to sell Mothboxes. What I'm actually trying to sell to you today is build your own Mothbox. I'm trying to sell you the concept. You can make this thing yourself. And I'll tell you a little bit about our design philosophy. Everything was kind of made in the field to be used in the field. And this is really important. And this is because whenever there's new digital technology, it tends to bulldoze a lot of existing practice and knowledge that exists in a space. You have like, wow, look, we have a computer. It can do bats 10 times faster than you used to be able to do bats. So you got to use this technology now. The problem with a lot of tech is it works great in a nice climate controlled place. It doesn't rain, works amazing in the lab. As soon as you bring it in the field, what does your technology usually do? It breaks, something screws up, something that wasn't planned for happens. It gets infested with army ants, something like that. And so we designed the Mothbox for failure. We designed it with lots of failure in mind. So there's no soldering, for instance, needed. We use these little lever nuts. If your wire breaks, something screws up with it, you can just pop it open, pop a new wire in, everything goes back together really quick. In fact, pretty much almost everything in a Mothbox can be repaired with a knife and a hot glue gun. So you can just go all MacGyver on it, hacking the wild, and really take apart your thing. Things that might be harder to find, you're out in the field, you just dropped your Mothbox off a cliff, it broke one of the arms, the cute little arms it has. What are you gonna do? You're in luck. You know why? All arms are 2 arms. Each one of the arms, it was 2 arms the whole time. You can just take one of these surplus redundant arms, move it to the other side. You're great. The lights are also doubled. One of your lights goes out, there's 2 lights there. We got bilateral symmetry for a reason, people. This is great. Another thing, it's all flat pack design. A lot of engineers are like, we want to do 3D printing. Let's make everything with 3D printer. Everything's got to be all 3D. That means that you pretty much have to have a 3D printer. If you don't have a 3D printer, especially a lot of 3D printers are really slow, you are kind of out of luck. But instead, we made everything's actually 2-dimensional inside of its design. So that means it can be laser cut. And laser cutting, it takes about 20 minutes to print all the parts in a laser cutter. So you could rapidly cut one of that. But the cool thing about it too, you don't got a laser printer or your laser cutter, you don't have a 3D printer. You could also just print these out on a piece of paper, use them as a stencil, and use hand tools. You can just use hand tools to build everything in the Mothbox. Another part of our design philosophy, everything was built super openly. I'm here today representing the Open Source Hardware Association I'm a board member of, and the Gathering for Open Science Hardware, 2 really cool groups. This is an amazing forum. If you're a scientist and you have any questions that are like tech-like, and you're like, hey, how do I, for instance, Denise was asking questions about how do I get, these camera traps to actually take clear photos of the butterflies. She posts on here, and fun nerds like me going and like, oh, let's try to help out. And so the whole time that we're making this project, and I encourage you to do this for not just hardware projects, for any kind of scientific project, document this and share it openly with other people. This is important. So we also like in wildlabs.net, another really good forum, scientists and engineers. Every couple of weeks, we'd post a whole update about what's happening, what do we change, what problems are we having, what are we working on. This helps you reflect, it helps raise awareness, create collaborations, lets you divide and conquer. It's an important practice to do. And again, why open source? As I mentioned before, because everything we do is open source. And if it's not open, it's not science. And this is really important because the basis of all science is that you're making something, you're doing something that other people who aren't you can also do. And if you're doing something with a black box and you're like, hey, I have my amazing cool device, it told me there's 8 new types of moths here. And someone else is like, oh, can I use your device to find new moths? I go, nah, it's my special device. And you're not doing science, right? If you have black boxes that other people don't know how they work, you're not doing science properly. It also means it's not equitable. Other people who don't have access to your special black box or can't afford the fees that you're renting it for, they're also not able to do it. And you're excluding them from the scientific process, which hurts your science in general. There's a lot of reasons for making things open source. I recommend going to the GOSH website in general. But I wanted to kind of end just talking a little bit about not only just open source, but kind of scientific responsibility in general. So there's a concept of extractivism. This is the key feature of colonialism. Something goes and takes out something of value and leaves the local area very affected, right? This is very easy to see in something like a giant mine, right? You have you have an area that's obliterated by a foreign company operating illegally, leaving the local area, the local residents with very little to profit from this. It's more difficult to see, and this is, again, this is, you can see this physically happening. They're scooping out ore, they're moving it to a different place. People are having fun with money. This can be harder to see in the academic version of. But luckily, amazing people like Alex Trio did really incredible presentation earlier this year and had this amazing juxtaposition, this very powerful juxtaposition of images. On the left, you have Wake and Vandenberg showing a kind of exploded map of amphibian biodiversity. And so you can see like, oh, look, the tropics, look, it's all big. The global south's really kind of all kind of, inflated. There's lots of cool biodiversity there. But then you go and see, where are the academic articles? Where is this information flowing to, and where is it getting locked up in? It is an entirely different map. You can directly see how this information is flowing to places and leaving the places that the information was taken from basically withered. And so the scientific knowledge, a lot of people do science because they're very enthusiastic about it, because they love science, right? But you need to also remember it has real value. Beyond even just like you got paid for an internship or something like that. You are creating value for companies, for institutions, and it's important that you try to not help this value just get locked away for your own personal gain or the gain of other institutions. Remember, your role in life is to not increase the H-index of pretty much anything. You want to find information and share it with the world. And so a lot of Western science can really function a lot like the mine. People parachute in, they pull out valuable things like information. They use this to increase the wealth of the countries or themselves, or big, institutions and things like that. And a challenge people have is, again, people really enjoy science, but it's really important to remember science is never neutral. Science is, we all love science here, right? But it's not inherently good, and it's not neutral. It's a thing that's very affected by your funding, the topics you're encouraged to work on, the places you're allowed to access, the ways you're allowed to share your work. These are all sculpted by different political entities. And so you are responsible for understanding the broader implications of what you're doing. Now, this all sounds really tough and complicated, right? Like, oh man, what do? I just want to do science, right? Well, hey, when things are tough and complicated, you don't have to be pure, right? We're never going to do everything perfectly, but just try to do something. Just try to find a little bit of your time to try to help. There's lots of ways to do this. You could mentor local scientists. You can participate in language exchanges. You can try to hold people in power accountable for what they're doing. They might even not know that they're doing something that might be odd or weird or exploitative. Hold de-stressing events. And perhaps most importantly, what we really enjoy doing, document and share your stuff publicly. Get your stuff out there so other people can do it too. And so that's been me. All the Mothbox information is right there. You have step-by-step details how to build your own. We have an Instagram full of lots of fun animals, because we also work at the animal rescue. So if you want to see sloths and tapirs very often, and feel free to email us at Dynalab. Yeah, and so that's been us.
If you have any questions, so the people on Zoom can hear, if you raise your hand, one of us will give you a microphone.
I know you're surprised about the trap camera being able to detect the moth. How did you develop your moth box to detect moths or other bugs?
Oh, so the cool thing about the Mothbox, it's not doing any detecting. It's literally just taking a time lapse. So if no bugs ever show up, you end up with a big, photo roll of like lots of blank white images. But the nice thing about that is you can then just delete those images, or get rid of them after you've like checked through like, hey, there's no bugs there or anything like that. We could build in like an identification thing, but the problem is that means that that whole system would have to be on all the time, which would then drain all of its energy. And so this is what lets it be able to sit at basically a really low power state for 99% of its life. Yeah. Next question.
I thought it was really interesting, and I appreciate you describing kind of your process with like working with Hubert to kind of come up with the idea for doing this overall. I was wondering, I think what you're talking about is like a very different model from what a lot of us are used to doing, which is when we work with people who make the technology, it's kind of a, it's less of a conversation. We just kind of say what we need, and then it's just like there's stuff that happens in the background, and then it just gets sold back for lots of money, right? So like, do you have recommendations for like someone who has an idea for something that would be really great to make for their research, like how to work with someone like you under this model, like just to get started?
Totally. So yeah, thanks for that awesome question. The resources I can really enthusiastically point out are wildlabs.net. It is a bunch of very enthusiastic engineers and conservationists. It tends to skew a bit more conservation side rather than like field biology, but that's just the background from where a lot of these people came from. But if you have something where you're like, hey, I've got, this, I'm not going to classically come up with weird metaphors. I got moths I want to look at or something like that. How can we do this? Like, type up a paragraph, post it on the Wild Labs forum, and there'll be lots of people really excited about chatting with you. And if they aren't, ping me, and I'll help boost it. But that's probably a great place. Same exact thing with the Gathering for Open Science Hardware, another online forum with a really amazing community of people from all across the world, from all 7 continents around Gosh, working together. And about 2/3 of them aren't actually within specific institutions. They're more so like weirdos like me, who are kind of between things and just really enthusiastic for trying to help things out like that. And once you've looked around at kind of those 2 spots, those 2 groups share a lot of cool events, and of a variety of different kinds of like DIY science kind of things. For instance, like the conference we had here 2 years ago in Panama, it spawned a lot of conversations that are still continuing today. So those types of events are super great.
Andy, so this is more a history question.
Sure.
I'm curious about learning more. What sources you can point us to about the hamburger
Cool.
that Americans wanted? Because from you just mentioned 1940s, 1950s. From what I've read and what Stanley Heckedon mentions in his book, is that the deforestation in Azuero goes even further back.
Oh, cool.
The cattle traditions that were implemented in Panama go even further back and to the Spanish. So I'm just wondering if you know, or we could find more information about if there was any further deforestation efforts pushed by the Americans, as you mentioned.
Cool.
So just curious about that.
No, this is great. And this is super cool for me to know, because basically what I knew was just when we were out in like Azuero, what people were kind of telling me about like, hey, it used to be like this. And then there's a bunch of cattle farms for when all the Americans came. So that was super anecdotal. That's the basis of where my knowledge of that came from. So I don't know much more else about that. But it's interesting that does seem to be at least a kind of the general thought pattern around there, especially because there's even groups around there who look for kind of community elders who were in Azuero before like 1940s-ish, because those people were there and they like bring them to like different school groups to talk about like, yeah, we used to have monkeys when I was growing up, and then it got all chopped down. So again, super duper anecdotal evidence. This is just from chatting with folks around there. But yeah, I totally, I'm excited to learn more too.
I just wanted to mention, I don't know if this is the book you were referencing, but I just found in the Smithsonian reference library section a book about the history of cattle production in Panama. And I noticed it did go back further than the 40s. It was like in the QR section or something. Anyway, you'd find it. It was like a doctoral thesis by a British scholar. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Kitty. Amazing librarian powers.
It looks like there's a question online. Charlotte, or can we unmute her?
Hi. You've got a group of us watching from BCI, so thank you for an awesome talk. And we were just wondering if you've noticed any other animals being attracted to the moth box as well, like small mammals or anything like that. Also, I just wanted to say that I received my trophy from Nekioki and I love it. Yes! So thank you for that also.
For reference, Charlotte won the Best Physicality Award at the Nekioki karaoke-a-thon that we hosted for International Agouti Day on August 23rd. So amazing work, Charlotte. And about your question, so I haven't seen any mammals yet, but I have, other than people, sometimes I've had like a person pop up behind it. But one of the reasons that we do every other hour at night is because some animals do start learning like, oh, hey, there's a bunch of cool bugs just hanging out. I'm going to go eat them. So we've encountered geckos a lot, praying mantises. Someone will crawl up there and start attacking things. So we try to turn it off about every hour to kind of give us a clean slate, let things flee. And ideally, some people say don't even do it every night in a row too, because other things like birds and stuff might start learning this is a hot spot for where the bugs hang out.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte.
I have two questions, sorry. Too interesting of a talk. So the first one is just wondering whether you have enough data already to figure out whether there's any kind of biases on the types of moths that come up to the light. Like sometimes when you use black light, it depends on the color of the sheet and the type of black light and all those things. So like there might be some differences in the kinds of moths that you get or not. So that's the first question. And then the second question is, thank you for talking about, you know, the importance of equity and inclusion and sharing open science. But one thing that people always talks about is actual tools and equipment. And sometimes people forget we're not necessarily thinking about computer processing or the kind of basically servers or processing that you need, especially if you're thinking about using AI and if you're thinking about, you know, trying to come up with programs that do IDs. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about where's the field on that? Like, how do you make that open source as well, right? Because now we have so much data all over the place that is open, but who uses it and who can actually process it is also very important.
Awesome. These are fantastic questions. So for number one, about potential biases of what's showing up to the lights. So when I first got on this project, I'm like, okay, I'm an engineer. They want to build a thing that pulls in bugs. And so I had this whole huge first list of questions that I went to all the biologists with. And I'm like, great, what wavelength of light do you want for the moths? You know, I got these different, they're like, and so we were like, oh, we need UV. I'll be like, no, actually, they respond better to green. And people are like, no, it's white light. And so then like very quickly I realized like, oh, there's a lot of questions. I thought all these had been solved. I figured scientists have been looking at the bugs long enough, they knew this. And then it turned out we're actually kind of building the tool to answer a lot of these questions. So we actually have like slated like on our list of like to-dos for probably early next year is start actually just running a bunch of comparative tests where we can have, and this is a nice thing about having a really low cost tool, is that we can have 4 of these set up right next to each other somewhere and have one that's just like UV only, one that's just green, one that's white light, one that's broad spectrum, and do a lot of these comparisons. Other people were like, oh, you need a yellow backing for the target. I'll be like, no, white. And I'm just like, oh, I just want to make something. Let me know which is the right answer. Turns out there's not just right answers. And so another thing, speaking of things that there aren't right answers for, AI. A lot of AI stuff is terrible. It's real horrible. It basically amounts to going a giant corporation tossing a bunch of like diesel. So I did a calculation once. So there's a thing called generative AI. You may have seen this. You're like, oh, make your cool, a Goody logo or something for that. It takes a ton of computing resources to do a lot of this generative AI work. You basically turn on a GPU, a graphics processor, a whole set of them on a server farm somewhere that's right next to like a big oil well. It just lights a bunch of this oil on fire to make this little processor spin, and you get like a stupid GIF of a Goody with rollerblades. I'm guilty of this. I did a calculation of this. Each one of those, the amount of carbon that it releases to do a standard 1,000 pixel image for one of those on most of the image generation things, it burns about the carbon of a piece of rainforest about 1 meter in size. So if you had that picture, like that QR code, if I generated that right now, we'd burn about that much rainforest just making that. So not a great thing, right? There's a slightly a nicer thing is that's generative AI stuff. A lot of analytical AI stuff can be handled a lot better. It can still be pretty GPU intense, but magnitudes of scale much less, and run locally. So everything, all the AI, we basically have a modified YOLO and a modified BioClip. Both of those are open source models. They show you what data they were trained from. So it's not as much like Google has this thing and it slurped up a bunch of people's deviant art to make their thing. But instead, you can see what these things are built off of, and you can hack and modify them your own. Some of these models you can actually just run off of a Raspberry Pi on the fly, consume way less energy. Our model right now, it can run on basically my 5-year-old laptop. It uses about as much energy as like someone playing Minecraft on their computer. For an example of how much energy it uses on my laptop, processing a whole night's worth of images, about 10 gigs of image from one night, it takes about 30 minutes or something like that. So it's burning up some energy, but it's a different type of thing, and we were trying to be very conscious of what we're going to use in order to be able to use these things. Another thing, this was caused by our limitations, because a lot of places we deploy this stuff, we don't necessarily have great internet. Even in Petasi, a lot of the internet's not very great. And so it was important to have something that can run locally and not have people have to upload hundreds of gigs every day in order just to process their images. But it is important to think about, especially when we start moving from traditional computing of like, I wrote this script and you can run this script too, to a lot of this AI-based computing, which is just like, we, again, just have an oil derrick and we start just burning oil and run a bunch of graphics cards to try to make your cool, weird image of a Goody with roller skates. So, yeah.
Okay. I guess let's take this one. Okay. Thank you for the presentation. One question I have is just kind of in general, and maybe this will speak to just who you are, but how is it that you maintain so much momentum with the Mothbox? Like it seems like, whether it's every day or like you're always like progressing. And I think that's something that I don't see often maybe in science, especially with engineering. It's like, as to what Jay said earlier, like you give someone something and then maybe, in 6 months, you'll get some feedback or you'll have some progression. But I feel like with you, like every single day, there's some increment, that you're working towards and you're getting, positive feedback and you're incorporating something. And so I'm just wondering like, yeah, is it due to like the community that you're in? Like, where does this like momentum and passion that you have for the Mothbox kind of like come from, and what does that speak to? Thank you.
Ooh, that's a good, tough, personal question. I mean, a lot of that comes from just kind of like, maybe just the way that I work. I've also, I don't know, there's something weird or wrong with me where I haven't worked real well in a lot of like kind of like stodgy institutions, and I've ended up having to, I don't know, move fast in order to be able to make things happen. I have just kind of like a core thing where the main thing is I just like, oh, there's a thing and I want to see it exist in the world. And that's the main drive there. And I just try to, dodge obstacles that kind of slow that down. But those all come with costs. For instance, like, yeah, we got like, 60K grant. I'm like engineer with a PhD, and we're we're paying ourselves about $3K a month in order to work on this. This is not like usually an engineer's salary, but we put in a lot of work beforehand in order to reduce a lot of our expenses. We have a very minimal lifestyle where we have very few expenses otherwise, so we're able to kind of craft our life around doing weird stuff like a Mothbox. Not saying this is for everyone, and not encouraging it. You should all work hard to get fairly compensated. Yes. Anyway.
All right. So if anybody else has any more questions, there's a reception upstairs, and thank you very much. And Andy.
Thank you for having me.